I'm Donna Nelson, a professor of chemistry at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm on the sound stage today at Oklahoma City Community College to interview another professor of chemistry, Dr. Nalley, who is in the Physical Sciences Department at Cameron University. Ann is a true native Oklahoman, a true Oklahoma daughter. She grew up in Oklahoma, got most of her education in the state of Oklahoma, and has been teaching at Cameron University for the last 40 years. Teaching organic chemistry at Cameron University, she has had over literally thousands of Oklahoma college students in her classes, and she's implemented many programs at grade school level, middle school level, and Oklahoma high school level to entice our Oklahoma students into science. In her research, she's collaborated with many Oklahoma companies. Those research fields include cosmetics, nanostructured materials, petroleum, and computer molecular modeling. She's incorporated her students into those research projects as interns, and many of those interns, upon graduation, took jobs at those companies and stayed in Oklahoma to give back to the home state. So I think it's fair to say that Ann has had more influence on science in Oklahoma than any other woman. She's won many research awards, for example, the Research Award from Sigma Xi, which is a scientific research society, the Professional Excellence Award from Iota Sigma Pi, which is an honor society for women chemists, and she's also achieved many firsts in her career. For example, she was the first woman full professor at Cameron University. She was the first Oklahoman to be elected president of the American Chemical Society, which is the largest single science organization in the world. She was the first woman to be named Oklahoma Chemist of the Year. And she was the first person to serve as president of the American Chemical Society and president of Phi Kappa Phi, which is the largest multidiscipline honor society in the world. So I'm really thrilled to have Ann here with me today. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Donna. It's my pleasure to be here.
And so I guess we should start appropriately at the beginning of your life. You grew up in Chakota, Oklahoma. And so did anything happen during your early years to influence you to become a scientist?
Well, let me start back with my Oklahoma roots first, and then I'll talk about what my life was like growing up. I am indeed a native Oklahoma, although I wasn't born in Oklahoma because my grandfather was a Cherokee Indian, and he was born in Oklahoma. His father migrated back on the Trail of Diers back to Oklahoma, and then my grandfather was born here in Oklahoma, and then my father also was born here in Oklahoma. It's interesting, my grandfather, or great-grandfather, who came back on the Trail of Diers, was actually shot by cattle rustlers. Oh. So this is sort of the Oklahoma story, and I could probably have a movie made about the life of my great-grandfather, but my education was all here in Oklahoma as well, and I began my schooling, and I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but you could figure it out pretty quickly because I started school at a one-room school, and in those days there were lots of one-room schools in Oklahoma. And so my first 4 years, I went to school at Elm Grove Public Schools, which had a total of 13 students in the class. And so for most of those years, the first 4 years, I was the only one in my class. And so my education was, for the least, certainly informal. And I did a lot of reading. And I think the first big influence that I had on my life was when I read the story of Marie Curie, the only woman to ever win 2 Nobel Prizes, a Nobel Prize in chemistry and a Nobel Prize in physics.
She's inspired a lot of women chemists.
I think she has. And I read the book once, and I read it again and again. I almost memorized it. And I even remember carrying crackers in my pocket one day because I read that she was very poor and had very unpleasant experiences as she grew up as a woman chemist. But that was the only, I think, only influence I actually had because there was no television then. to see a video, they would bring, about once a month, they would bring a projector in and show a movie. But I never had any opportunity to have a woman chemistry teacher or a woman science teacher then. Then when I was in the 4th grade, I transferred to a larger school that had over 100 students in the elementary school. And my 8th grade science teacher, who was taught all 8 grades, but he liked science, had a little bit of influence on me, and he actually inspired me to think about science because he taught the math and the science, and he actually moved with me when I started high school to Shakota High School, and he was actually my physics teacher when I was a senior. When I started high school, there was no physics class at my high school. Oh. Shakota High School, where I went to high school, is a very small school. At that time, we had like 350 students in all 4 grades. And I remember, I have again remind you how I grew up. I grew up in the country, and my bus route was 60 miles long. So, again, part of my education was informal because I did a lot of reading on the bus. But as I started high school, I knew at that point in my life I'd already made up my mind that I wanted to be a scientist, although I'm not sure I knew what a scientist was. Mm-hmm. But all my impressions of science came out of books. And so, my freshman year, we signed a petition to the principal to have a physics class offered my senior year. So my legacy for my class was that we were in the first physics class that was ever taught at Shakota High School. Hmm. Well, as a result of that, in order to take physics my senior year, that meant I had to take lots of math, and I had to take chemistry my junior year. And so the next big influence on my life was my high school chemistry teacher. His name was Jackson Emerson. Again, it was a man, because in those days there were not many women scientists. There were very, very few women who were chemists especially. And I took chemistry my junior year. He decided that I should be the one that would take the high school chemistry enter the high school chemistry contest, and that meant I should finish the book by December, which I did. And as a result of that, I did well in the high school chemistry contest. And he submitted my name for a special government program. I started high school in 1956, and in 1957, a big event occurred in the United States. Launching of Sputnik. Mm-hmm. It didn't occur in the United States, but it occurred in our country, and it had a big impact on the United States. Right. And I think as a result of that, I, like many others in my age group, were greatly influenced by that, because the United States suddenly said, we're behind Russia, we have to do something. Right. And so they started lots of programs to try to entice high school students to become scientists. And I was the benefactor of one of those programs, because my high school chemistry teacher nominated me for the Oklahoma High School Institute, which was a National Science Foundation program, which paid all the expenses for young people like myself to come out of rural areas and go to college for the summer and take classes and do research and become scientists. And I remember when I got the call, I was sitting in history class. We didn't have a telephone then. I said this, maybe I'll say this again later on, but I came from a very poor family. And the possibility of my going to college was sort of only a dream at that point in time, because I'm not really sure I knew what college was, but I knew you had to do that to be a scientist. And so the call came. They came and got me out of history class, and they said, you've been selected for the Oklahoma High School Institute. And I remember then I went back home and told my father, and I could tell he wasn't really excited about it, because he wasn't sure, because I wasn't going to be available to work in the field that summer, because as a country kid growing up on the farm, we were supposed to work in the fields in the summer. But in spite of that, my parents, although neither of them had an education, they realized that education was the pathway from poverty to success in life. Right. And so 2 months later, they loaded everything. I think I must have taken everything I had, because I'd never been away from home before. And they loaded me in the back of the pickup with everything I owned, with my 3 brothers and sisters, and we packed into a little pickup and we're off to Oklahoma State University for a summer experience in research in chemical engineering. And ta-da, forever it changed my life.
Yes, for the better. Much
for the better, I think, at least. It's been a great experience for me.
So now, you attended more than one college in the state of Oklahoma, and so you knew you wanted to be a scientist, but were you encouraged to be a scientist at any of those, and at what point did you decide that you wanted to go into chemistry in particular?
Well, as a result of that summer experience at Oklahoma State, I came back home from that experience with a slide rule with my name engraved on it, with lots of publicity, with my picture on the front page of the Shakota paper, and lots of inspiration. And so I came back my senior year, took the physics class, and I was a good student. So because, again, my parents encouraged us to always excel in school. And so I took lots of all the math and science I could possibly take in high school, which is what I always encourage every young person I meet to do.
Yes.
And I took lots of math and science, and as a result, I did get a scholarship. I began my college career at Connors College and went there again, full scholarship.
That's in Warner.
In Warner.
Mm-hmm.
Warner, Oklahoma, which was close to where I grew up. And I went those 2 years, again, took all the math and science I could take, and then transferred to Oklahoma State in chemical engineering.
In Stillwater.
In Stillwater, yes. And at that time, I was the only woman in chemical engineering at Oklahoma State. I was the first. And I'm still not sure that the male professors thought I should be there. Mm. But they didn't try to discourage me. They just didn't give me any special encouragement. And I guess one of my first really bad experiences was taking unit op lab in a Quonset hut when I was climbing up a ladder to look at a big distilling column we had set up, and it blew out the top and blew oil in my hair. And I remember trying to shampoo it out, thinking then, is this what you really want to do the rest of your life?
Yes.
And then the following summer, I had an opportunity to do a summer internship in chemical engineering, and it was sort of the same bad experience, wearing coveralls, and it was a dirty job. It was a Louisiana paper company in Baton Rouge. Mm-hmm. And I decided then maybe I didn't really want to be a chemical engineer. Maybe there was a better thing I could do, like some of my friends who were in my classes were actually in chemistry, because I took my physical chemistry with the chemistry majors. And they said, you might not really want to do this. And so I changed my mind and actually finished my degree in chemistry.
Now, after you received your BS degree, you started teaching high school. And so what was it or did something happen that made you decide that you wanted to go back to graduate school and not teach high school?
I did start my career, actually, after I got as I was getting close to the end of my chemistry degree, that was in the 60s, and the employment opportunity for chemists was not really very strong at that time. And so I thought, well, maybe I want to teach because I can get a job anywhere as a teacher. So I went back an extra year at Northeastern at Tahlequah and got a certification in teaching to teach chemistry. And so I started my career at Muskogee Central High School. Mm. Again, Oklahoma story all the way.
Right.
And I taught and I had the opportunity at that time to get a job there because they had a really good chemistry teacher. And I did my practice teaching with him. But there were not enough chemistry classes for a full load in teaching, so most of my load was in math. Mm. So I taught math and chemistry. And being a new teacher, I taught the classes called remedial math, and that was for all the discipline problems. Uh-huh. And again, someday when I retire, I'm going to write my story called My Version of Up the Down Staircase, because that was not a very good experience for me either. Mm-hmm. I was single. I was not, well, I'll just put it like this. This would take a whole another hour to tell this whole story. The gist of it is the day I saw my car blow up on the side of the road, I decided then that I didn't really think I should be a high school teacher.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, they took my spark plug wires. My problem was I came there late as a young teacher. There was no room for me in the faculty parking lot. So they said, "Oh well, you just park in the student lot. You look like a student." And so they put me in the student parking lot. and I didn't have a car that would lock, and so they put stuff in my gas tank. They took my spark plug wires. They let all the air out of my tires. And then they did something to my car that made it blow up on the side of the road one day, and I decided, there's better things I could do. Following summer, I was off back to school again to Oklahoma State University, where I took courses in math, thinking that if I did go back to teach, it wouldn't be in chemistry, it would be in math. But in the meantime, I found out that they pay you to go to graduate school.
Yes, chemistry is unusual.
What a novel idea,
yes,
that I could get money and go to school at the same time. Because I must have been very naive, because I didn't realize that as an undergraduate. They don't do that as much in chemical engineering, even as they did in chemistry.
That's right. We've got so many labs in chemistry.
It's
you
true.
have to have a lot of
Yeah.
graduate students to oversee them.
So I applied. I went to the chemistry department and applied for a teaching assistantship for the fall, deciding then that I wasn't going to go back to high school teaching.
Right.
I called Muskogee High School and asked if they would if they would honor my release from the contract. They did. The chemistry department offered me a teaching assistantship, full-time actually, so that I could go back and take courses. And again, my life changed. I didn't go on to teach high school. I only taught the 1 year. And I went back to Oklahoma State and thinking I was going for a Ph.D. Again, I'll have to put this into perspective. Here I am. I'm in graduate school. I'm taking classes. I've gone through my 12 years of K through 12 schooling. I've gone through 5 years, including my extra year to get my certification to teach. I've yet to meet a woman science teacher,
Wow.
a woman chemistry teacher,
Yeah.
and the same thing didn't change when I went to OSU.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, there were still very few women in chemistry or in science. And so I started graduate school there were 42 in my entering class in graduate school, 3 women and 39 men. And I just don't think we got very much encouragement to go on and go for a Ph.D. I probably should not tell this story, but I am, so maybe we'll edit it out. One summer they sent a memo around and said, only men will receive, funds are limited, only men will receive support. Women should have husbands to support them.
So that would be the teaching assistantships.
The teaching assistantship. So I had no support. And the other 2 women who were my colleagues in my class, one was not very happy, and she filed the first ever affirmative action suit against the university. So that was sort of, I think, my signal that maybe this isn't the place I wanted to be for my graduate training. And the next year I finished a master's and I thought I'll finish my master's. I started writing my thesis and decided I would leave if I could find a job. Again, this is 1969, and the employment for chemists was really down at that time. And so I didn't have the opportunity to get a job in industry, which is what I thought I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably the best thing that ever happened to me,
Yeah.
because otherwise I probably would have gone on into industry and not have had the wonderful career that I've had as a teacher. So I was in one of my supervising professor's office, who I worked with as a graduate teaching assistant. And he said, Ann, what are you going to do when you graduate? And I said, good question, because I've sent out 40 resumes and applications, and I don't have any offers yet. And he said, have you thought about teaching? He said, you've done a really great job as a teaching assistant while you were here. And before I knew what was happening, he reaches and picks up the phone and calls Cameron. He was a former president. His name was Colonel Breedlove, and he was a former president at Cameron, where I teach now.
Uh-huh.
So he picked up the phone, and he called Donna, who was the president. He said, I have someone you should have on your faculty. And ta-da, the next thing I knew, they were up there the next day interviewing me, and I signed a contract, not ever having seen Cameron.
That's great.
And so that's how I got my first job, and that's when I decided not to stay and pursue a master's or pursue a Ph.D. at Oklahoma State.
Yes. And so then you went to Cameron, and you were teaching there for a while, and at some point you decided to go ahead and get your Ph.D. down at Texas Women University in Denton, Texas. And so you sort of did at least part of that degree long distance, didn't you?
Well, as a matter of fact, I didn't teach sometime at Cameron. I only taught a year at Cameron. I went there as a young assistant professor and looked around me, and I said, I don't want to be here as the only woman and not have a PhD.
Everybody else had PhDs.
Well, either they had PhDs or they were working on them.
Oh.
And so, because I knew the men were going back, and so I said, this is not for me. I thought when I left with a master's I'd never go back.
Uh-huh.
I left with sort of the impression that they really don't want these women to get PhDs, so maybe I'll just be happy with a master's. But when I went to Cameron, I realized that if you wanted to stay in a four-year institution and you really wanted to have a successful career in education in college, you needed a PhD.
Mm-hmm.
So
still true.
Still true today. And so it was. There were in community colleges some women who could teach with masters, but I think at the four-year level, it was not even an option. So the following summer, I applied for a National Science Foundation grant, and I got it, and I was off again. That summer I spent at Texas Women's University.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the rest of the story comes back because I went back to Cameron and told them that I decided I wanted to go on for a PhD. So I began looking to see how I was going to finance that. Well, again, I came back to the fact that chemistry is a great profession to go on for a graduate degree because they pay you.
The teaching assistantships.
Well, it was even better.
Research assistants.
Even better because at TWU, I went there on a National Science Foundation grant, and I went back to interview to go back there. I hadn't made up my mind really if I would go there or to some other school. And so I interviewed also at North Texas. And the reason I chose these, I had a family, and I had a husband, and he was with me in Lawton, and I needed to go someplace close enough to Lawton so that I could see him occasionally.
Right.
Marriages work better if you see your husband once in a while. And so I actually had decided that probably I wanted to go to Denton. I didn't go back to Oklahoma because we were undergoing, Cameron at that time was working toward North Central accreditation, and they needed more degrees from out of state. So I knew I wanted to go someplace in Texas, and Denton was a reasonable distance away. So I'd interviewed at North Texas and at TWU. But what really made the difference for me was when it came back to TWU, they offered me a university fellowship, plus the professor that I wanted to work for had a Welch Foundation grant.
Yes.
Now, unless you've got a school in Texas, and you went to school in Texas,
I was also a Welch Fellow.
Yes. And again, and I tell my students this, that it's okay to teach all the time, but it's a lot harder to teach and do and then do your research.
Yes.
And the Welch Fellowship enabled me to work on my research full time and paid me to do the research. And so that's part of the reason that I went to TWU. They paid me more, and at that time, that was important in my life because we wanted to buy a house. We were trying to. We never really went in debt when I was in graduate school, but we certainly weren't wealthy.
Yes.
And
now, these Welch Fellowships come from the Welch Foundation, and each university in the state of Texas has some Welch money to support graduate students, and often these fellowships even pay a little bit more than the teaching assistantship.
That's right.
So you get paid for just simply doing your research.
That's right.
Without teaching.
They did, and it gave me time to devote full time to research, which was very important to me because I was on leave from my home institution at Cameron, or I needed to take leave. I went there in the summer to do research, but then I had to do my residency. And so it was very important to me to be able to devote full time to research. And so the Welch Fellowship enabled me to do that. I wish Oklahoma had a Welch Foundation or some foundation like that, which would help young faculty get started here in Oklahoma. And I also, I had a wonderful professor at TWU. Again, I've traced my educational career up to now and reminded you again that I never had women mentors. I'm still there. I'm working on for a PhD now at a university, Texas Women's University, which had no women
That's amazing.
on their faculty.
That's amazing.
No women. I still couldn't believe it. Here I am I'm still searching for that woman mentor, which is yet to be found.
That's amazing.
But
at least you were at a university where you knew they would tolerate women,
well,
welcome women.
Exactly. And even though I'd never had a woman professor, I have to give credit. My research professor was Dr. James Johnson, and he was absolutely, totally, wonderfully supportive for women, and so were most of the other faculty there. Because, and I remember him saying to us, I'll put my girls up against anyone because they're the best. And he always told us that, so he gave us so much self-confidence. And so I think it totally changed my self-image, having the opportunity to work for him.
That's great.
And again, the Welch money was nice, and I did get a Developing Institutions grant through Cameron, and I was able to complete my PhD with only a 1.5-year residency at the university, plus my 5 summers. And the way I was able to do that is I did part of my research at Cameron. So I had to do some career balancing, some life balancing things, and I had good support. And so, again, I'm about to finish a PhD. I haven't seen a woman chemist yet. Literally, this
other
is
than yourself.
Other than myself. And at that point, I had been able to go to professional meetings, and I knew that there were a few of them out there, so there was still hope.
But a few and far between. Well, you've been a faculty member at Cameron now for 40 years.
This is my 40th year.
And you've passed many milestones there. So what's your experience been at Cameron, or what changes have you seen over those 40 years?
Oh, many changes. For me, it was the right career for me, I think. I had opportunities that several times during my career where I could have left. And part of the reason I didn't is, again, it's the career balancing act that you have to do along the way. You have to figure out how you can manage to keep a husband, if you want one, and to have a family and educate children and all of that. So I ended up staying at Cameron, and I went there when there were really not. I went there the first year. Cameron was a 4-year school. So I've had the opportunity to watch the program grow. We graduated, our first graduates in 1970. I came there in 1969. I was the first woman to be tenured. I was the first woman to be full professor. I was the first faculty member ever to get their Distinguished Faculty Award. I helped start the Phi Kappa Phi chapter and then went on to be the national president. But Cameron has been very, very supportive. I think the best thing that one of the best things I think I've done at Cameron, and Cameron has done for me, is part of our role as a regional university was to support industry in the community, or to support community. And my way of supporting the community was to help small businesses get started. And Oklahoma has been very, very good about that. And actually, they've developed a whole program that's devoted to that called OCAS, the Oklahoma Center for the Advancement of Science and Technology. And I've been one of the benefactors of that, and the companies that I work with have, because I received the first when they started the ORS program, the ORS intern program, which is the Oklahoma Applied Research Intern Support, which allows university students to work in industry, and the state pays half the salary. So I wrote one of the first proposals when the program started, and I was funded. And I actually received an award from OCAS called for Outstanding Contributions to Economic Development in Oklahoma. And as I look back through my career, I've helped start 6 companies. And I'm actually working with a couple of those right now. And I'm really excited because some of the research that I've done with one of the companies I'm working with now is actually going to be presented at an international conference next month. So I think the changes that I've seen is Cameron has grown. Our department, our number of graduates has gone up and down. I like to think that I've been influential in it because we've had lots of women graduate over the years, and they've done really well. We actually have 2 women on the faculty now, so that was another really big change.
In your department?
In our department.
And so you've gone on to be a national leader and even an international leader, especially once you achieved this national president of the American Chemical Society. And so what are some of the experiences that you've had from that?
Well, I guess I am, in a sense, an international leader. I actually, before I even became president of the American Chemical Society, I was elected to their board. And then I was appointed to the American Chemical Society as part of what's called Pacifichem. And Pacifichem is an international organization which supports research and development in the chemical societies that border on the Pacific Ocean. And there's a governing board, and I was the first woman to be appointed to that governing board.
And you've been on it for 10 years?
This next year will be my 10th year, in 2010. And that my term will expire then, because our terms are for 10 years. And when I was appointed, they said, we're really hesitant to appoint you as the first woman because the Japanese do not like working with women. And I said, I'll make them like working with me. And it's been a really great experience because when I won the national election to the American Chemical Society board, actually to the presidency, one of the first letters I received was from Japan. And I actually had the opportunity to go and meet with the Emperor of Japan.
That's nice.
And then also, as a president of the American Chemical Society, I was invited by Russia to come to Moscow to speak before Putin's government to talk about innovation and how countries can change how the industry government operations work. I was invited last year by the government of Taiwan to come and be a keynote speaker for an international conference on women in science. And then I'm also a member of another international board, which is called the Malta Conferences. I'm the deputy director of the Malta Conferences actually this year, and it's actually 2 years now. And what the Malta Conferences do is they bring the countries of the Middle East together. And what we believe should happen from this is that by bringing scientists together and developing working collaborative relationships between them, we think that world peace will come not through war and terrorism, but will come by scientists working together who can then educate their government. So I'm probably most excited about some of the international activities I've done. I've had wonderful experiences here in the U.S. as well, because when I was president, I said there will be no group too small, no place too far that I won't try to go to be the voice of chemistry.
I do remember, as the president of the American Chemical Society, it seemed like you were traveling constantly.
And I did. As I look back, I traveled more than 300 days out of the 360 when I was president. And many times I would fly in the morning and fly back out that afternoon. And I became a million miler on American Airlines, which was even more exciting. So I guess my legacy has been that if I never had the woman role model, I think I've had the opportunity to be a role model for women, not only here in the United States, but all over the world.
Absolutely.
And when I first assumed the position, I guess I didn't really have any idea of the impact that you could have, because I was pretty naive. I didn't realize that conditions are much worse for women in other countries even than for us here in the United States. I feel like I've been a pioneer in a sense of helping make a difference for women here in the United States, but I think I've sort of started my pathway of helping women all over the world. And as I would travel to the other countries, especially in the Middle East, and women would hug me, and then they would hand me the card, and on the back they would write, "I love you."
Yes.
And when you see that, when you see that they just want to touch you, and just it gave them hope that there are women somewhere that have climbed over the barrier, and they hope that there's some way that they can. And I get letters from them all the time. And as a part of this Pacifichem, I organize joint conferences with other countries. And for the next Pacifichem, I'm organizing a symposium on women in science, and it's co-sponsored by Korea and Japan. And so it was a wonderful opportunity to be a voice for chemistry, but I think also to be a voice for women and an inspiration for women all over the world, and for young girls here in the United States. So I still get many, many letters, and I did have the opportunity lots of times to appoint women to positions that they would not have otherwise been able to get from some of the male presidents.
When you were first starting to run for president of these organizations, were you expecting to be sort of a science ambassador internationally? Did you realize how that would go?
I never really planned it. It just all happened. I started with one thing, and it just gradually grew and grew. I've always been totally dedicated to hard work, and I always I tell my students this, and all the young women that I mentor, that it's okay to work harder than everybody else. It's okay to work 14 hours a day.
You
may have to do that to achieve your goals in life. And in doing that, I think that people appreciate it. Even the men, they may not like you, but they have to respect you for what you've done, and the fact that you're working harder and you're out there doing, when everybody else has quit and gone to bed that night, I'm still there doing something. And so, no, I never had a clue. I never had ever a goal that I would be president of the American Chemical Society. I was the 5th woman in history. And the first woman, I did have the opportunity to meet Anna Harrison before she passed away. And I was the 3rd woman to be president of Phi Kappa Phi. Mm-hmm. And even then, when I went in as their president, I was the first woman to do lots of things for them. As a matter of fact, I started the travel grant, the international travel grant, the international program that we do now for REU, for the National Science Foundation. I feel like I had an opportunity to have an influence on that. So I didn't have a clue. I didn't. I think none of this was ever planned for me. It just evolved through my life, and I think I've been very, very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time.
It seemed like you came along just as the American Chemical Societies was wanting to become more active internationally.
I think they did, but even then, they needed some pushing, and the Pacifichem was the real push for me, because I think a woman brings a different perspective than the men do. And I think they needed me when I came on board, because I fought very hard. For example, they said, we can't do undergraduate research poster awards this time. It's just too much work. And I said, it's not too much work. I said, we just have to find a way. And so I guess that's sort of been my driving force in my life, is finding the way. Mm-hmm. What is the way to get this done? Not giving up and saying I can't do it.
Right. It's very important to include the undergraduates. Now, you've had many research collaborations with Oklahoma companies, and it seems to be quite varied. It's gone all the way from zeolites in concrete to aloe vera in cosmetics, and along the way you've always involved students in your research and in these collaborations. And so what do you see as the most important contribution you've made?
Well, as I said earlier, I think probably the OCAST grants were the most important for me and for my students. But all the work that I've done, even before OCAST, I was putting my students in as interns. And as a small university, I could do things that people at big universities couldn't do, because I really never cared whether I got publications or whether or not I got property rights, patents, or whatever. What I cared was, because my product is my students, and I thought, what the things that I do for my students to help them get jobs and help place them is what's most important for me. So I actually began, even I think probably in maybe my 7th or 8th year at Cameron, I began working with small companies. And they would come to me with projects, and I'd say, okay, if you'll pay my students, we'll do this. Because I never really cared whether I got paid or not, because I thought what is most important for them to get paid. And then I started working with this cosmetic company in 1974. I had Edna Hennessy started the company, but she brought I had 2 of her children in my class, and they said, can you help us? We want to order equipment and make some cosmetics. And I said, we'll make them right here in the lab. Mm-hmm. And so we did the exploratory work for a company now that has grown to more than 5,000 customers worldwide. We wrote an SBIR grant for them and got funding to build a greenhouse. And we have the largest greenhouse-grown aloe vera farm in the United States. We've done all sorts of research projects for them over the years. And
that's all taking place down in Lawton?
All taking place at Cameron. Mm. And we actually did a joint project before we applied for the greenhouse. We have a greenhouse at Cameron, an ag department. We actually grew aloe vera in our greenhouse and developed the kind of soil and best growing conditions for the aloe vera, and that led us to get the aloe vera farm. But in the meantime, I've been at Cameron, although I've been there over 40 years. I have gone other places, and I went to University of Southern Mississippi as what's called a Poly-Ed Scholar, and that was a National Science Foundation program which enabled me to go away and learn something new. While I was there, I learned to do computer molecular modeling because that's what they wanted. When I went there, you had to pick up a polymer institution, and you had to fully devote yourself to polymers in order to comply with the provisions of the grant. And I had to choose a mentor. I chose Dr. Lon Mathias, who was on the faculty at the Polymer Research Center there at University of Southern Mississippi. And he said, I want you to learn computer molecular modeling and as it applies to polymers. And so I immersed myself for 2 years in molecular modeling and learned to do molecular modeling and came back to Cameron. And then we got funding to build a computer molecular modeling lab at Cameron. And so a few years later, I had the OCAS grant, Oklahoma Center for the Advancement of Science and Technology. I was placing interns, and I sat down next to the Vice President of Research at Halliburton. And I said, you should be supporting my intern program. He said, well, what can you do for us? And I said, well, do you realize that all of my students at Cameron are trained in molecular modeling? Because I knew Halliburton was really getting into molecular modeling. And he said, your students can do molecular modeling? I said, yes, they can. And so about a week later, he called me and he said, come over and I'd like to meet with you. We have some projects we'd like to talk about. So I went over and talked to him, and that following summer, we were able to place one of my students as an intern at Halliburton. And it's interesting because we started doing something called software engineering. And software engineering is a process where you actually take software that companies have developed and you edit the software and work all the bugs out of it and work with the company to edit it. So one of my students did that project for them for the summer, and that went so well. They said, this was really good. We want you back next summer. So I wrote another proposal the following summer, and I had 2 students working on another software engineering, except this time we went a step further. We did software development, and we helped a company develop the software to calculate log of POWs. And log of PO, it sounds like this is not prisoner of war. It's partition octanol water coefficients, which is the best indicator of how effective a chemical will be absorbed by sea organisms. And it's a very, very important factor that all oil field companies or any company that works in offshore operations, Halliburton, for example, worked in offshore drilling and dumped some of their materials back in the water. But there are limitations on what they can dump, and these are controlled by the international standards which limit the POW values. Well, anyway, to make a long story short from this, one of my students went there for a summer as an intern and helped develop software, and she did physical measurements and of log of POWs by HPLC and octanol water actual with separatory funnel separations. And one of her values was accepted as an international standard. Oh. So we were really pleased because Halliburton was drilling offshore, and an inspector came aboard, and one of the chemicals they were using was not on the international standard list. So we called back to Halliburton. He said, what kind of measurements do you guys have on this? And Janet Seawright, who was my student, they pulled up her data, they sent it back, and then that value later on became accepted as the international standard. So that's an example of
Congratulations.
Well, we were pretty excited about it, and Janet was certainly excited. What's really neat was last weekend I brought her back as one of my successful graduates to speak at my symposium last weekend. But that's a typical story of how undergraduates can play a very important role in research with industry. Yeah. And I think sometimes what we as faculty don't do is we don't give them enough credit and we don't give them the opportunity. So I'm very pleased. I could probably keep you here for several hours telling you many success stories because that's only one of many. because, as you said, later on we did research in zeolites, we did graft copolymers of natural polymers like guar. I've worked with this for many years, but I had a student who did graft copolymers for Halliburton to make the polymers more environmentally friendly. A lot of people think just because it's a natural polymer that it's easily biodegraded, but that's not the case. Mm-hmm. Turns out that you can graft organic moieties onto the polymers and make them much more environmentally friendly.
And all of this work done by these students really prepared them for jobs later on.
Oh, definitely. Not only for jobs, but for getting into graduate school, into medical school, and all the neat things. And you said earlier in the introduction that many of my students are working at Halliburton. And actually, one of my last interns who was employed at Halliburton in a summer internship is still there. Uh-huh. So they hired her. And most of the BS people who work at Halliburton are my graduates. So I'm really pleased, and I think we are. The other success story, the vice president at this cosmetic specialty lab, which is one of the first companies I worked with on my OCAS grant, the vice president of that company was one of my interns. And what's even more impressive is that she worked for me as an undergraduate as a SEED student. And SEED is a program that the American Chemical Society has for undergraduates, for high school students who are disadvantaged.
Right.
So the stories go on and on and on, and you probably don't want to sit and listen to me for 3 more hours bragging on the success of my students, but my students are who I am.
Yes.
And their successes are what I am.
Well, now, you should say a few words about how you've balanced your career and family, because this is becoming more important to young women who are making a decision about, how much do they want to devote to their career.
Well, one of the most important, I think, pieces of advice I can give to young women who want to be scientists or who want to be professionals is to marry the right man. And in my case, I married the right man because I was very fortunate to have a husband who has supported me and who realizes that I'm not going to be there at 6 o'clock cooking his dinner at night. And part of the way I balanced is that he learned to cook for himself early on. And my son was really good at making ramen noodles. He can cook ramen noodles 97 different ways. And bless his heart, he actually liked them. And so balancing the career and family, was a very small family because all I have is Robert and one son, George. And I haven't seen nearly enough of my 2 grandsons. So I don't think I've been really successful at balancing my career, but my husband has been super supportive and very understanding, and so he just knows that sometimes we spend time together on weekends, but most of the time we see very little of each other through the week. So it's not easy, I think, for a woman to balance career and family. I think you have to find that happy medium, whatever works for you, and you have to get the right man, and it's not easy. So my heart goes out to all the young women who want careers, because I don't think it's easy, not just in chemistry, but I think maybe it's a little more demanding in chemistry because we teach labs, we teach long labs, we work with students in the evening, because if you're going to do research, at least at a school like Cameron, you got to spend time with the kids outside their normal 8-hour day, because there's not enough time. Yeah. Because you have heavy teaching loads. Yeah. So you just learn whatever works for you works, and you have to work around it. My son, when he was a junior and senior in high school, spent lots of time in the library, and I think that's one of the reasons he's so successful today, because he could use that library backwards and forwards. Then he'd come to my office and sleep on a pallet in the office till I went home at night, till he got to where he could drive. So you do whatever works for you, but it isn't. I'm not going to tell anybody that it's easy.
Yeah, and there's not a cookie cutter solution. One size fits all.
No.
So each person has to look around to see, as you said, what fits right for them. And in the last 10 or maybe 15 years, there's become more and more emphasis on role models and mentors. So what do you see as the one thing that role models or mentors could provide best, do you think?
Well, I said a little bit earlier about how I never had the role models or mentors when I was growing up as a woman. But I think it's what I'm seeing and what I've observed over the last, I'd say, 25 years. It's getting better for women. There are more women there now, like you and I, who have gotten our degrees and who've stayed around and who are mentoring and role modeling, because if you are the only one out there trying to do this, you sometimes say, is this all there is? Is there no hope? And it's even worse, I think, for minorities.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
For example, here in Oklahoma, where we have so many Native Americans, we have so few, you're one of the few, women or men either. We don't have men or women who are role models really in the sciences for young men and women. So I've been writing these grants. I've written 2 grants for NIH to try to do some mentoring with minorities here in Oklahoma. But I think it's critical. I think that, because I've heard people have said to me, "Oh, you've given me new hope." Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes they just want that hope. But there has to be people who are willing to take the time and who are willing to reach out to them, to go out to where they are and tell them, there is something. You can start, like I have this picture of myself and how I started with my 2 grandfathers, my Cherokee Indian and my Scottish grandfather, standing in a cotton field. And the cotton is as tall as I am. And somebody has to tell them that you can go from this cotton field to anything you want. Now, nowadays, young people don't see themselves in cotton field, but they see themselves in roles very much like that. And many, many times when I've gone out to speak to them, they say, "Oh, you've given me new hope." I actually did this talk on the fable of the ugly duckling. It's one of my favorite fables, where the little ugly duckling is born. He's so different, but it's okay to be different, because you can still overcome whatever obstacles in your path, and that fable of the ugly duckling is a wonderful story. So I think Oklahoma needs to get on the ball. Not only Oklahoma, but every state needs to get on the ball and make sure that we're providing the mentors and the role models for our young people.
Yes.
But I see Oklahoma as having some real problems, because we have many, many young people out there who have never had the opportunity to be mentored.
Yes.
And I think they're crying out for it.
Yes. And that there's another point about Oklahoma. Oklahomans seem to have a lot of courage and this ability to face a problem straight on and deal with it. For example, Oklahoma has had more scientists become astronauts
That's right.
than any other state. And so what opportunities or what challenges or benefits do you see for Oklahomans in particular, and what message would you give to Oklahoma children that are considering going into science?
Well, I said earlier, I didn't elaborate a lot on. Last weekend I did a symposium where I brought back my graduates, all of whom were Oklahomans. And I brought them back for a symposium because I wanted to show my students that you can start here at Fletcher, Oklahoma, which is where Ed Huffine, who's, by the way, one of your graduates as well.
Yes.
He did his BS degree at Cameron and then went on to OU to get a master's in biochemistry. From there he went to work as a forensic chemist for the FDA, and then from there, or FAA, my husband would get me for that. And then from there he went to Washington, D.C., and he ran the DNA identification of the military. And then from there, he's been interviewed 5 times on CNN. Wow. He's now the vice president of Bodie Corporation, and he's world-renowned for his ability to identify remains of humans in mass graves or whatever. He was the lead investigator for the 9/11 incident. They brought him in to head up a delegation to identify the bodies after 9/11, and he's from Oklahoma. He's from Fletcher, Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. But he came to Cameron, and I was his mentor, so I feel that I played a key role. Another one of my students who came back last week was Paul West, who started at Cameron. He had a degree in music, and came back and got a degree in chemistry at 30 years old. Went on and got a PhD, and he came back and he's doing research now in stem cell. And he showed the most, as a matter of fact, they did a wonderful interview with him, and there was a great article in the paper about his stem cell research, which is the hope for problems like the thalidomide babies. There will never be thalidomide babies again if we can use stem cells in research to identify what problems we're going to encounter with pharmaceuticals on the embryo before it ever has contact with a live embryo. So anyway, these were just two of the examples. And then I brought, Tammy Henson, who was one of my graduates who works for Sandia Laboratories. And Tammy actually builds the mirrors for the Hubble telescope. Mm-hmm. And she also builds mirrors and other devices, optical devices that are used in satellites. And I can't tell it, but some of what she does is proprietary. But, wonderful opportunities. Mm-hmm. And she's had a very, very successful career. So I guess my message is that Oklahoma is a great place to grow up because we have as many opportunities as we want to take advantage of. And I encourage all the young people to try to do exactly what I did, to find that summer opportunity where you can go and learn about research or learn about some special activity, because we do have a lot of summer camps here in Oklahoma, and summer science camps, or even at an earlier age if they don't want to wait till high school. We have actually two at Cameron. We have a NASA space camp, and then we have the Science Explorers Space Camp. But I can simply tell them that there's no limit. Just because you're from Oklahoma doesn't mean that you can't be anything you want to be.
But it would be nice if our existing successful scientists from Oklahoma would be given more prominence and featured more and held up more as role models and mentors to our existing students.
I had to get a grant to bring my students back, but I don't get these grants every day. So this was a one-time event now in 10 years at Cameron that I was able to bring back successful people. If we had programs like that, if I could have had Paul and Tammy and Janet Seawright, who was my student who worked for Halliburton, if I could have those, or if I could make videos of those and show those all over the state, look what a wonderful impact we could have. We have the role models and mentors out there. It's just that we can't bring them back to Oklahoma to have them in contact with our young students. Feature them more.
To inspire the next generation.
I think Oklahoma keeps its secrets very, very well. We don't brag nearly enough. Matter of fact, sometimes I think we even play down the fact that we have a lot of successes here. So we need to do more to toot our horn and tell our stories and inspire our young people.
And that's what we're trying to do with this this video. Yeah. So thank you so much. Is there any last message that you'd like to give? I really appreciate you coming.
Well, I think I've said already what I believe, that there's no limit to what you can accomplish in your life if and that's what I tell my young students, and I tell my grandchildren, and I'm telling you and everyone else, that if you're willing to go that extra mile and work extra hard, you can become the president of the world's largest chemical society. You can be testifying before the Emperor of Japan,
or the U.S. Congress.
Or the U.S. Congress, which I did many times as well. I was the voice before Congress throughout my presidency. So my message is, go for it, because the opportunities are there. They're waiting for you, and you can follow my path, which has been long and rugged, but it took me to the point where I wanted to go in my life, and I never thought I'd be there.
And it's been very exciting.
Very exciting. It's if I could put it into words, the excitement and the wonder of what I experienced during those years that I was out there. And even this last year when I went to Taiwan, when I went there, there were two women from the United States. I had no idea. The other one was from MIT. I'm from Oklahoma, from Cameron University for a 4-year school, and I did all my education here. Not from MIT, not from Harvard, from universities here in the state of Oklahoma.
Well, we're going to have to work and change this perception,
That's right.
and inspire the next generation.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Ann. It's been a
you.
great joy having
Thanks.
you here.